Three fall horror stories. The Watcher by the Lake. Autumn in the countryside was peaceful, especially by the lake where Nora's family had a cabin. Every year they spent a week there, soaking in the vibrant colors of fall, the cool air, and the stillness of the water. But this year was different. There was something wrong about the lake. It started the second night. Nora woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her window. She lived far enough away from any neighbors that the sound made her heart race. She peered out into the darkness, expecting to see an animal, but instead, a figure stood by the edge of the lake. It was tall and gaunt, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend with the night. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and it stood perfectly still, facing the water. Nora stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity. It didn't move. The wind blew through the trees, but the figure remained rigid. After a few minutes, she turned away from the window, her skin crawling. The next day, she told her family about the figure, but they brushed it off. "Probably just a fisherman," her father said, "or some kid messing around." That evening, Nora saw the figure again. It stood in the same spot, motionless, staring out at the lake. She watched it for hours, but it never moved. When she finally went to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, even though its back was turned. On the third night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps again, this time closer. With her heart hammering in her chest, she looked out the window. The figure was still by the lake, but now it was facing the cabin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel its gaze piercing through the night, straight into her. Nora locked the door and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she packed her bags and left the cabin early. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching her go. She never forgot what she saw. The Scarecrow of Thistle Hollow. Thistle Hollow was known for its pumpkins. Every year, the town's pumpkin patch attracted visitors from all over the region. But nestled on the outskirts of the field was an abandoned farm that no one dared go near. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, except for one thing: the Scarecrow. Standing tall in the middle of the rotting crops, the Scarecrow had been there for decades. It was dressed in a weathered flannel shirt, its straw-stuffed body hunched on a wooden pole. But what unnerved the townspeople wasn't its presence. It was the fact that the Scarecrow always seemed to move. Henry didn't believe the stories. He was new to Thistle Hollow, having recently taken a job at the local diner, and figured the town's lore about the Scarecrow was just small-town superstition. But the stories intrigued him enough that he decided to investigate for himself. One late October evening, Henry made his way to the abandoned farm. The air was chilly, and the sky was a deep gray, the sun sinking below the horizon. The pumpkin patch buzzed with families picking pumpkins in the distance, but the farm felt isolated, as though it existed in a different world entirely. As Henry approached the Scarecrow, he noticed how it loomed over the field, its empty eyes, carved from old leather, staring down at him. The flannel shirt it wore flapped slightly in the breeze, but something about its stance felt wrong, almost as if it was leaning toward him. He shook off the feeling and stepped closer, trying to get a better look. The Scarecrow's face was crude, stitched together with bits of sackcloth and burlap. But there was something about it that made Henry's skin crawl. Its mouth, sewn into a twisted grin, looked almost human. A gust of wind swept through the field, and Henry swore he saw the Scarecrow's head tilt ever so slightly in his direction. He took a step back, heart pounding. Suddenly, the sound of rustling filled the air. Henry's eyes darted around, but he saw nothing, just rows of dead crops in the approaching night. But the sound grew louder, closer. He turned to leave, but stopped when he heard a creak. Slowly, the Scarecrow's wooden post bent forward. Its arms, stuffed with straw, jerked unnaturally, as if trying to free themselves from the pole. The grinning face turned toward Henry, and its leather eyes gleamed. Henry stumbled back, frozen in terror. The Scarecrow pulled itself free from the pole with a sickening crack and stood upright, towering over him. Its grin widened. Without thinking, Henry turned and sprinted back to the pumpkin patch. Behind him, the scarecrow's heavy footsteps thudded through the dead crops. He didn't stop until he was back among the safety of the families picking pumpkins. When he turned around, the scarecrow was gone, but its post stood empty in the distance. That night, Henry packed his things and left Thistle Hollow. 3. The Whispering Woods. In the small isolated town of Black Hollow, autumn was both a time of beauty and a time of fear. The woods that surrounded the town, known as the Whispering Woods, were notorious for the strange things that happened once the leaves began to turn. While most townsfolk avoided the forest as the days grew shorter, teenagers often dared each other to venture into the woods, especially on crisp October nights. Most came back with nervous laughter, but a few never returned. The forest had always been shrouded in mystery, and the elders of Black Hollow often spoke of the ancient spirits that lived among the trees, spirits that stirred when the leaves turned red and gold. But like most things, the stories of the Whispering Woods became legend, then cautionary tales, and finally just spooky tales passed around for entertainment. Until the fall of 1987, when the woods proved their deadly reputation once again. That year, like most years, a group of high school friends decided to test their courage and spend a night in the woods. There were 5 of them. Jason, the ringleader with a cocky attitude. Mike, his quieter but equally bold friend. Anna, Jason's girlfriend, who was more curious than brave. And Rachel and Dan, the 2 who were reluctant, but didn't want to be left out. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the treetops, they packed their bags and hiked the short distance to the heart of the woods. The air was cool, the ground littered with fallen leaves, their crunch the only sound as they walked deeper into the forest. Their destination was an old abandoned cabin they had heard about, hidden somewhere within the dense trees. It was said that people who entered the cabin would hear voices, whispers that echoed through the night, guiding or deceiving those who dared listen. By the time they reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sky had darkened into twilight. The cabin was worse than they had imagined. Its roof sagged and the wooden planks were blackened with age. Vines curled up its sides and the windows were nothing more than empty holes. But that only made Jason more eager to prove his bravery. "This is perfect," Jason said, setting his bag down in front of the door. "We'll be legends at school." Mike nodded, though his face was pale, and Anna looked around uneasily. The air in the clearing felt different, heavier. Rachel glanced at Dan, who was staring at the trees. "This place feels wrong," Dan muttered. But before anyone could respond, Jason pushed open the door with a creak. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. Dust floated in the beams of light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. There was nothing inside except a broken table and an old stone fireplace, but the silence was oppressive. "Let's light a fire," Jason said, but no one else moved. The others exchanged nervous glances. As the night settled in, they sat around the small fire Jason had managed to start. The flames flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. For a while, they told stories, each trying to outdo the last with tales of haunted places and ghostly apparitions. But the atmosphere was thick with tension, and every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind outside, made them jump. Eventually, the conversation faded and silence filled the cabin. It was then that they first heard it, the soft whispering. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it grew louder, distinct, like voices murmuring just beyond the walls. "What is that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably the wind," Jason said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But the whispering continued, rising and falling in a strange, rhythmic pattern. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dan stood up and moved to the window, peering outside into the darkness. "I don't like this," he said, his voice shaking. "We should go." But Jason shook his head. "No way. It's just the wind or the trees. Don't be a baby." As the others hesitated, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Now it was clear. The voices were not random. They were calling names. "Jason, came the faint whisper, barely discernible but unmistakable. Then, Anna, Mike. Each name was spoken softly, almost tenderly, but with an undercurrent of something darker. The others froze, exchanging terrified glances. Jason stood up, backing away from the fire. "Who's doing that?" he shouted into the empty air. No one answered, but the whispers continued, now overlapping with one another, the voices blending into a maddening cacophony. Jason bolted for the door, throwing it open, and ran outside. The others followed, their breaths coming in panicked gasps. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this one.